ladies and gentlemen, Toby Heaps.
It's a pleasure to be here today in Halifax. I just came from one of your radio programs, the Maritime Morning Show, and the guest following me was speaking about exotic dancing. So I'm not sure what that portends for your next speaker. I'm following in Blair Feldman's steps. I just want to warn everybody before I start, I speak a little bit quickly sometimes. Ed Broadbent once accused me of sounding like an auctioneer on speed. So if I get out of hand, wave your hands, and I'll try and slow down. So Corporate Knights is sort of like a halfway house between Forbes, Adbusters, Greenpeace, ExxonMobil. So there's a lot of real estate to cover in between those two realms. But at our essence, our mission is to try and make business part of the solution to the pressing environmental and social problems that the world faces. Not because it's a nice thing to do necessarily, but because it's a necessary thing to do in a world where over 50 of the largest entities aren't countries anymore, but corporations. So it's sort of the predicament that we're in. I'm going to talk about a few things, but I guess to start, I just wanted to talk about three kind of really poignant driving forces that make it really relevant for corporations to be part of the solution and for having a green economy and a leading green economy to be part of a competitiveness strategy. The three driving forces are the first one, which I sort of hit on, which is no business can succeed in a society that fails. That's a truism that few would argue against, and it also holds for the environment. No business can succeed in an environment or ecology that fails. And that's one of the reasons you see so many leading businesses coming out in favor of strict carbon pricing and trying to reverse the trend and the road that we're down for dangerous climate change. So that's one truth that there's no getting around. And when we sit here in the Maritimes, we don't have to look any farther than the codfish that used to be out and the collapse and what that did to 20,000 jobs, or the amount of forests, the old growth forests that have been almost completely decimated and continue to be decimated, with private landowners usually exercising cuts that use 99% clear cut in difference to what the long-term consequences are. So that one truth is not going away, and it's becoming more true every day. The former about 2 years ago, the Millennium Ecosystem analysis found that 12 of 20 crucial ecological services that mankind depends upon, that the planet provides, are in serious decline, and we're depleting them more quickly than they can replenish themselves. So 12 to 20, that's freshwater services, climate regulating services, soil remediation, and we're going down that path, and it's just becoming more and more pressing with 10 billion people on the horizon. So these trends aren't going away and they're here in front of us. The other two are summed up in two countries, the U.S. and China. What's interesting about the U.S. is probably the most fundamental public policy shift that's happened in the last 2 decades is about to occur in the United States. It'll happen within the next 18 months. Right now, it's in the form called the Lieberman-Warner Act. That's a climate change bill, and what the bill will do is put a serious price on carbon, starting at $15 to $20 to $30 per ton. But what the bill also calls for, and this is where it becomes extremely relevant for all of us in Canada, is it calls for border adjustment taxes or countervailing duties on other countries, developed countries, and developing countries, including countries like China, that want to export their products into the U.S. The reason they're doing that is they initially came up with the bill and they didn't have those provisions, but it's been through 6 iterations now. Various congressmen and various industry have had their say, and what the U.S. industry is afraid of is if they have to internalize the cost of carbon, which is not a small amount of money. If you put a $50 price on carbon, you're talking about $350 billion a year just for the U.S. economy alone. So if a small number of industries, because carbon is concentrated in a small number of industries, are going to bear that cost, what it would do is it would decimate the U.S. manufacturing sector that's carbon intensive if they didn't have some sort of protection. So they legitimately have a case. But the problem is it's the U.S., and we all know how things like softwood lumber tariffs and import tariffs work. And there's a huge slippery slope that's going to happen there because it's not all that well defined. So if we in Canada don't have our ducks in a row when it comes to carbon pricing, internalizing our carbon costs, we're going to be extremely, extremely vulnerable. Already, the oil patch in Alberta, which has invested billions and billions of dollars in infrastructure that has attached us to, like an umbilical cord to the mother, to the U.S. in order to have a market for our oil, they're just going to be able to hand over fist and put a $50 or $30 charge at the border, and we'll see billions of dollars. It'll make softwood lumber look like chump change. Instead of picking our pockets, we'll have our pants taken off. So that's something that's right on the horizon, and the sooner that we can get out in front of the U.S. on carbon pricing and be ready, the stronger our case will be, and the less susceptible we will be to these types of countervailing charges that are being levied. The third thing is China. China is such a fascinating country. Sometimes I feel like China is like the Christmas tree that everyone wants to hang their complaints on for all the things that are going on with labor, or you see what's going on with Tibet, or you see what's going on with pollution. The one statistic that I've heard in the last 5 years that really scares me is regardless of sort of what happens in the industrial world, in the industrialized world, in China right now, according to the International Energy Agency, China's on track to double the emissions of the next 26 largest countries combined in 25 years. So in 25 years, you'll have one country, China, emitting twice as much greenhouse gases as the next 26 largest countries combined. That's Brazil, India, Canada, every large economy, the U.S., 20, so twice as much. And that's what they're on track for right now. Every week and a half, they build a 750 megawatt equivalent coal-fired power plant. Fairly dirty coal, no carbon capture and storage, limited cogeneration. And the reason they're doing that is there's no price on carbon, and they're going down the path of least resistance and least cost. So, but within that Chinese economy, there are trillions of dollars being invested in their future energy infrastructure. And so, as the world moves towards putting a price on carbon, and the U.S. will probably be instrumental in bullying, for lack of a better word, countries like China to do that, there's going to be an immense market for those companies and those engineers and those technologies that can help the Chinese deliver low-cost carbon energy to their population. And so there's a huge opportunities, especially for people that have expertise in coal, in cogeneration, and carbon capture and storage, 3 areas where there's abundant testing grounds here in Halifax. The sort of, I guess, I mean, those are the three things. So we're talking about U.S., the China, and then ecological limits that we're facing. What needs to be fixed broadly, and I'll just talk about 3 things that need to be fixed broadly. They're a little shorter than the 3 things that I just spoke about. And then I'm going to go into 10 examples of really interesting things going on in the corporate world, specific corporate examples where corporations are starting to become part of the solution in a pretty massive way. And then I'm going to go into 8 examples of leading jurisdictions around the world that have come up with really innovative policies to help create the circumstances where, if you're a business, it makes sense to do what's good for the environment as opposed to doing something that's good for the environment and then hurt your bottom line. So the 3 things, though, before we get started, that there's 3 gaps. And the first gap is the price. Communism is said to have failed because the prices didn't reflect economic truths. One could probably say that capitalism is on track to fail because the prices don't reflect ecological truths. So right now you can spew emissions into the air, toxic effluent into the river, garbage into the landfill, and you don't pay almost anything. In most cases, you pay zero, less. And those pollutants and effluents create a lot of externalities for society, and the costs are not in there. So companies that want to do the right thing, I had the co-CEO of JP Morgan tell me, look, we don't want to invest in these coal-fired companies necessarily that aren't doing leading-edge cogeneration, or we don't want to invest in these tobacco companies. But the reality is the way our price system is rigged, and he used the word rigged, is that the destroyers end up succeeding in our economy more often than not. And so we have to fix the price system. So I'll go into a little bit about how we can fix the price system. And there's all sorts of opportunities in lieu of a federal government that may not want to take the leadership position for provinces to do it. And examples even right here in Canada where that's already happening. The second thing is time. And the time factor is a lot of corporations, especially publicly traded corporations, are under immense pressure from the public markets. It's not necessarily, what have you done for me lately in terms of the last year? It's like, what have you done for me lately in the last 10 minutes? Every quarter, managers, CEOs, they're under such pressure to deliver their quarterly targets, whereas if they don't deliver their quarterly targets, they could be out of a job, their interest rates go up, they lose confidence in the market. And so we have an economy where you have 75% of executives answering a survey by PricewaterhouseCoopers where they say, we would do what's expedient for our corporation in the short term at the expense of its long-term interest, knowing that it was at the expense of its long-term interest because we have such immense pressures to deliver in the short term. So we have a bit of a problem with the time horizon. So there's money or prices and time. And then the other thing is the focus. And I think sometimes if you want to get something, I'm a big fan of, I guess you heard that I had some involvement with Ralph Nader in 2004. So you probably appreciate that I'm a bit of a fan of banging my head against a brick wall, even without getting the bricks to move immediately. If we're trying to fix an economy and we want to swim upstream rapids, violently quick rapids, you have ExxonMobil making tens of billions of dollars of profit right now, not doing what we would call a sustainable economy. They're surfing down the rapids. They're just sort of cruising right now as long as they can. So if we want to sort of fix this, we have to be a little creative on how we frame what we want and the solution for what we want. We can't just say, let's green the economy and expect that all the forces of human nature, self-interest, are all going to converge upon that. We have to find a better way of framing that. And I think the way to do it, and it's starting to happen in the U.S., there's some interesting initiatives going on, is we have to tie the green economy, join it at the hip inseparably to green jobs. So when we talk about how we're going to get rid of 1 million tons of carbon dioxide, we shouldn't be talking about that. We should talk about how we're going to create 6,000 jobs in installing cogeneration and maintaining cogeneration. How are we going to create 4,000 jobs in installing geothermal and replacing and upkeeping geothermal? How are we going to create 30,000 jobs being the wind hub of the world, like Germany has done, where they've created 70,000 jobs in the wind sector? So we have to look at the opportunities for improving the economy and add up how many jobs that can make, get the prices right, get the training right, and then deploy it. But the more that we can think in terms of jobs and things that are good, more of things that are good as opposed to less of things that are bad, like pollution, the more quickly and easily we're going to get to our destination, because then we won't be swimming up the rapids, the violent rapids so much. We'll be sort of more in a calm lake. We'll still have to paddle to move, but it won't be as vicious of a current going against us. So I'm going to say a few words, and I feel like I'm speaking quickly here. No one's waving their hands. I'm going to say a few words about some of the interesting things that are going on in the world. There's a thing called the U.S. Climate Action Partnership, and it was something that was born a couple of years ago. It involves some of the largest corporations in the United States, companies like Duke Energy, Citibank, J.P. Morgan. And what they're trying to do is they're viciously lobbying in Washington with their K Street lobbyists, K Street being where most of the lobbyists that decide or influence policy in the U.S. live. And they're allocating a huge amount of resources to get the U.S. Congress and the U.S. Senate to put a price on carbon. Now, you don't have ExxonMobil as part of that group, but you do have a pretty big tent group, and they're calling for a pretty hard price on carbon. And the reason they're doing that is they recognize that if we keep going down the path that we're on, we're going to either end up in a dangerous, destabilized world where business can't succeed, or before that, probably trade anarchy when you get countries like the European Union putting a price on carbon and then responding to countries like the U.S. that might have dragged their feet. So you have these people in finance who have longer-term views and not necessarily as much of a dog in the fight. But you also have people who have a dog in the fight, like Duke Energy. And so that's happening right now. And it's interesting to see that people like J.P. Morgan, they're spending 50% of all their lobbying money trying to get climate change law passed in the U.S. So that's a huge change. You have big blue-blooded investment banks trying to change laws for the better to get the price system fixed. People that have seen what's wrong and they're trying to fix it. So you've got companies like Google that has recently put into their charter that they will focus on the long term irrespective of what the markets want. The markets want the short term. That's okay. Sergey and Larry own more than half the company. They can focus on the long term. And there's an interesting parallel in that too, especially out here in the Maritimes and the Canadian economy in particular. A lot of our companies have been hollowed out in the last few years. You look at the TSX 60 and it's like it's a bunch of them are now sort of refugees. You know, Inco, Alcan, Molson, Montreal Canadiens. You can go down the list, and Domtar, and now their head offices are in Brazil, the U.S., Britain, Australia. But what's interesting about the family-owned companies is, although they've been criticized for poor corporate governance because they have dual share structures where you have a controlling shareholder that doesn't own the majority of shares but owns the majority of voting shares, I think there's really interesting opportunities to take a longer-term perspective, and I'll get to that a little later with one of the more famous families out here. You've got Osra Technologies, very interesting company. It's probably going to be the most important company to the U.S. energy footprint in terms of the change from depending on coal for baseload to depending on a renewable source for baseload, which isn't traditional solar. It is solar, but it's concentrated solar thermal, which instead of photovoltaic, which uses a lot of silicon where there's a shortage and a high cost and not necessarily great returns in terms of being competitive with things like coal at 6, 7, 8 cents kilowatt hour with a decent price on carbon. Concentrated solar thermal already can generate baseload power in the middle of the day when the factories are humming, the air conditioners are humming. And the way it works is it takes parabolic mirrors, concentrates the sun's energy, and then boils water, generates steam, just like a thermal plant would do with coal. and then puts that onto the grid. And so you've got multi-billion-dollar projects going on in California, coming up in Nevada and Arizona, obviously places where there are a lot of sun. And what's really kind of neat is OSRA, founded by a Canadian, a former CBC technician, who I guess is having a pretty interesting career post-media. So that company is funded by Vinod Khosla, who's one of the co-founders of Sun Microsystems. So obviously someone with some entrepreneurial flair. You've got all sorts of money flowing in the venture capital world. 10% of all venture capital money right now is flowing into clean tech. Some of the most high-profile, successful venture capital investors in the world, not just the famous sort of Bill Gates and Sergey Brin and Larry from Google and all those guys, but people, Kleiner Perkins, the sort of the top venture capital firm in the world. You have their founders saying that clean tech is going to be the boon of the 21st century. It's the hottest thing in the 21st century. So the venture capitalists, they generally know where the streams are flowing pretty quickly. So that portends some interesting things. And they're basing that analysis on the fact that society is not going to let mankind walk off a cliff. And so it's a bit of an optimistic scenario planning, but that's what they're basing it on. And these are people that are used to risking a lot of money and making a lot of money. So it's interesting to see them coming on board. You've got Masdar. This is really interesting. You've got the Middle East making billions of dollars. You have these sovereign wealth funds, some of them as big as $800 billion. And what's happening now is we're seeing a bit of a correlation between the price of oil and then their comfort and ability to invest in the energies of tomorrow. So in the United Arab Emirates, they're raking in the cash right now. They're taking $15 billion and they're building a completely 100% renewable power city called Masdar. And it'll be a testing ground for new technologies, for new renewable technologies, solar technologies, different types of green grids. They're building that right in Masdar, called Masdar, a new city. And they're able to do that because they have the luxury of having all that extra money from the $100 plus barrels of oil. So it's interesting you see a correlation between the price of oil and then the ability of Arab dictators, or maybe benevolent dictators in this case, from the renewable energy perspective, going and having the means to invest in the economy of tomorrow, and recognizing that it's in their self-interest too. Although they may not be alive in 50 years, they can look back in history, and especially in Egypt, and see how people took a 2 or 3 or 4 generation perspective and built pyramids. I mean, who would build a pyramid today under today's capital markets? It'll be built by the time my great-great-grandson is born, maybe. And so you're starting to see some of these things resurge, and I think that offers some promise too when you start to get something good out of something what most people would not consider too good. You've got initiatives like Catalyst Paper, a great Canadian paper company. Forestry sector is being really hard hit. Catalyst has reduced their emissions by 6 times more than they're required to under Kyoto since 1990. And the way they did it is pretty simple. They substituted their fossil fuel dependency for energy and started using biomass. And so doing that, they were able to avoid 1.3 million tons of emissions into the air. So there's all sorts of solutions happening all over the place. The Forest Products Association of Canada already, according to them, the forestry industry in Canada creates 57% of their own energy from biomass. And FPAC, Forest Products Association of Canada, says there's nothing standing in the way between going from 57% to 95%. All that's standing in the way is the availability of capital. And this comes into that whole time perspective sometimes. There's a lot of things that do make sense if you cost them out and look at them over the 5 or 10 year term, but then you have demands on capital and companies don't always have the money available. So if we can figure out ways to get money, upfront capital costs, and eliminate some of those barriers, that will open up tremendous doors for all sorts of things that happen in the economy, especially even at residential levels when you think of things like geothermal. You've got Bill Gates, Bono, Gore, all these guys running around. Bill Gates has his $65 billion foundation. He's out there to solve the 20 most pressing diseases facing humankind in the next 20 years. So he's lowered his ambitions a little bit from Microsoft Vista. You've got Bono. He 2 years ago at Davos, he's had an idea. He's like, let's figure out what the world's leading brands are, and then get them signed up and get something kind of cool like Red. And so he has Gap Red, Motorola Red, all these brands selling red T-shirts, red phones. And when it first came out, people thought it was a lot of fluff and it wasn't going to amount to much. Well, I just checked the latest figures yesterday. Over the last year and a half, Red has generated $50 million for the Global AIDS Fund. And so that's something that's growing, and it's an example of where a portion of your purchase can go to something good. It's still a drop in the bucket, but it's just an interesting use of market mechanisms where you can generate just a little small fraction of something can generate a lot of resources if it's well targeted. And then you have Irving. Irving is a really interesting company. We're getting ready to do a profile on the Irvings, obviously a big imprint and footprint here in the Maritimes. But the Irvings are the only family that I've come across that's a billionaire family in heavy industry in the entire continent of North America that has come out in favor of the Kyoto Protocol, and did come out in favor of the Kyoto Protocol publicly and tried to push for it. And I was perplexed at first, why would a company that's chopping down trees and in the oil and gas industry be so keen on having something that would put a price on carbon and would create a lot of costs that they weren't already facing. And the reason is because they've made earlier investments, because they made a prediction on which way the future was going, and there would be stricter regulations around carbon pricing. They've made investments in alternative energy, in wind, and have a whole portfolio coming up. But not just the alternative energy, on the traditional energy, and having a low carbon mix and a better ability to respond to carbon pricing. So because they were able to take the long-term view as a family-owned enterprise that wasn't pressed to hit the quarterly returns, they're much better positioned to face a carbon price or carbon-constrained economy. And so for self-interest reasons, which is fine, sometimes usually the right things happen not necessarily for the right reason, they're being proponents of helping to fix the prices in our economy. So it's an interesting situation we have here in the Maritimes, especially, where we can look at how do we leverage the long-term perspective that can be embedded in family-owned enterprises to achieve sustainable systemic outcomes. In government, most of you have probably heard of the BC carbon tax that came out. A lot of flair and a lot of things going back and forth. Basically, it's $10 a ton, rising to $30 a ton. What that means is gas prices will, over the next few years, will go up by about 12.5 cents per liter. Doesn't sound like a lot of money, but even if you just take a small portion, even if you were able to, if you put a 10-cent price on gasoline, or for all transport fuels in Canada, not just BC, for all transport fuels, that would allow us to reduce income taxes by 10%. So it's a pretty sizable amount of money that gets raised. Jack Mintz, who some of you, I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with, one of the dons of the economic right and sort of bastions of the tax world in Canada, from the C.D. Howe Institute, recently published a paper, and it was the 9th paper that he had created when he was working for Paul Martin when they were slaying the deficit, and they came up with 9 priorities, and this was the sort of 9th priority, and it was about carbon tax shifting, about using the federal fuel excise tax and then giving that back through income and corporate income tax cuts to people that would allow for the 10%, a 10% reduction from current levels, not 10% in total. And so you have people like that jumping into the fray, and it starts to get pretty interesting. People, traditional bedfellows you wouldn't have expected, and then you have them jump. You have David Frum jumping into the fray with David Suzuki, calling for a carbon tax too. So it's starting to get pretty interesting with the carbon tax, but there's probably a couple things we should sort of about the carbon tax to clarify, because there's a lot of miscommunication and befuddlement going on with carbon taxes. Some people say, well, if gas prices have risen 60 cents in the last little bit, how is a carbon tax of 10 cents going to make any difference? Well, the reality is it's not going to make a huge difference in terms of I'm going to have to go buy a smaller car now just because it's 10 cents more expensive. That's not how it works. But how it does work is that money is a huge amount of money. We're talking tens of billions of dollars for the Canadian economy as a whole if we put a serious price on transport fuels. And then you can use that money to funnel back and do some creative things. If it's not put into general revenues, you can use, say, half of it to give rebates, not tax cuts, but rebates, call them sort of like Ralph Bucks like they had in Alberta, but give them rebates to people starting out with low-income people to make sure it doesn't become a poor tax, and then getting out through the economy. And then you can use the other half of the money for carbon innovation. So an example would be Manitoba. They've got a really interesting program for geothermal, where if you want to install geothermal or geo-exchange heat cooling pumps in your home, you phone them up, they come by, they do a little audit, and then they do it. They pay for it, and then you pay them back on your bill at a low rate of interest, 4 or 5% over several years, and so you don't really notice it. Your bill is actually a little bit lower instead of higher, because you're no longer paying them for the heating and cooling services you were paying them before. And the only barrier stopping that is that there's not the upfront capital. So if you have the money there as a pool and you use it as the upfront capital to make low interest loans available to people that want to save money, make money saving, carbon reducing investments, then you can get amazing benefits coming out of it. The other I guess misconception about carbon taxes is, so gas tax is one type of carbon tax, but then there's also if you do it on electricity. So let's say you put it on, I think we might have some friends here from Emera. Let's say you put a carbon tax. Emera is the 8th largest greenhouse gas emitter in Canada. Nova Scotia is a significant coal-fired economy, and that's by the nature of the endowments. Nothing wrong or nothing wrong with that. Just that's how it is. So if you put a price on carbon, say even $30, and you set it up where you had that money going from Emera into a special carbon innovation fund, and then America then withdraw as much money from that fund that they deposited as they liked to make investments in carbon-reducing technologies, whether it's cogeneration or if sequestration geology allows, carbon capture and storage, or investments in new energy systems, or even more importantly, and this is the crucial gap for renewable energy in most cases, in green grids. Green grids, if we have green grids, we haven't invested our grids really in any substantial way in 30 or 40 years. And because of that, we have all these inefficient AC alternating current lines and not high voltage DC lines where we can get power from where it exists and then get it to where it's needed, but only losing a few percent. So investing in green grids that can allow people to have their homes with solar and then feeding in when they don't need it, or with their wind turbines, that's a huge necessity, because that's an enabling condition for hundreds of thousands of people, or 950,000 people if they wanted to get into it in this province, to get on board and do it. Right now, the practical reality is that it's not possible for that many people to have their own power feeding into the grid, because the grid can't take it. So that's a huge opportunity. You have things like fee baits on cars in Canada. Most of us will know about that. You can get up to $2,000 from the federal government rebate on a fuel-efficient car, and then you pay up to $4,000 fee bait on fuel-inefficient cars. Self-funded. It goes back and forth, so you're charging more for inefficient cars, charging less for efficient cars. You have the toxic use reduction fees. This is really interesting. So Massachusetts, in 1990, took a look at the toxics, and they had a fair amount of toxics per capita and a large concentration of people. So they thought, how could we reduce it? Well, the easy way, obviously, is to put a price on it. It's not free. That would be one incentive. So they did that, but then they went one step further, and this is where it's kind of interesting. It's not necessarily a logical sort of step that you would have expected them to take, but it had a really interesting result. Then they required all the polluters of a certain sort of threshold of pollution to come up with plans for how they could eliminate the toxic emissions or effluents and to cost it out. They didn't require them to implement the plan or anything like that. But the funny thing was after all these companies did that, and they saw, oh, jeepers, this would only cost us X dollars, and we're paying Y dollars on the toxic tax, and Y dollars is more than X. Why don't we do it? It was just handed to them as a turnkey. Now, they reduced between 1990 and 2000 in Massachusetts. They reduced their toxic emissions by 90%. So it's doable. It happens. I mean, smart policies, taking advantage of people's self-interest, where they don't want to have to pay more tax than they need to, they work. But sometimes there's just that thought that needs to be connected, that information gap that exists, and so just make them do it, and then let the voluntary effort carry through. You have things like pay-as-you-throw for garbage. And outside Edmonton and St. Albert, you pay $1.90 for one bag every 2 weeks, or $22.80 for 6 bags every 2 weeks. So it's a bit of an incentive, $50 a month if you want to be a garbage pig. And a lot of people are responding, and their waste is going way down. Their recycling rates are going way up. In Denmark, there's a levy on pesticides. Especially with the cost of pesticides going up. I don't know if anyone's noticed. 2 days ago, I think, potash became the #1 capitalized company on the TSX. It's no longer Encana. It's no longer RBC. The #1 company now on the TSX is Potash, a company from Saskatchewan that makes fertilizer. So these types of fertilizers and non-organic ways of growing food are getting increasingly more expensive. And so what Denmark did was they put a 54% tax on the use of pesticides, not necessarily on fertilizer, on pesticides, and then they gave the money all back to the same farmers they were taking it from through a reduction on land taxes. And so they've seen a huge drop in the use of pesticides in their agriculture industry just by doing that. The cost, zero. In terms of the economic cost, the environmental cost, huge upside. You've got feed-in laws in Germany, as I talked about before, with the solar industry. They've created there's 300,000 people in Germany who have solar power on their homes. There's 20,000 megawatts, so that's a huge number, 20,000 megawatts of wind power installed in Germany. And there's 70,000 jobs that have been created in the wind industry. Those are long-term direct jobs, not multiplier indirect jobs, which obviously are additional. You have Ontario with a solid feed-in tariff, and the only thing that's constraining, there's a line all around the provincial legislature, people lining up to build wind turbines in Ontario. The only two things holding them back are the grid can't take it in some areas because the grid hasn't been updated, so that's something we need to do. And then the other thing is this really curious thing. It's a bit of a tangent, but this NIMBYism, and not in my backyard syndrome, it just perplexes me. I come from Alberta. My mom, she lives in rural Alberta, and close to where she lives, Suncor has put in place a sour gas well. Sour gas is fairly poisonous if something goes wrong. which it doesn't usually, thank God, their whole community can be poisoned to death. So you can understand that there would be not in my backyard syndrome going on. But somehow, Suncor, they come to the barbecues, they put up the little traffic light, they talk to everybody, they go door to door, and they spend a couple of years, and it's not a question of if they're going to do it, it's just when they're going to do it, but they don't put it like that. And they're able to put these sour gas wells in my mom's backyard. And so I figure if they're able to do that in my mom's backyard, these wind people can learn something from Suncor. And one of the ways might be to have a mandatory sort of stakeholder relations courses for people in the wind industry that are having trouble with the NIMBYism. Because Suncor told me just offline, they said, we originally thought wind was going to be boring for us. We thought there was too low barriers to entry, too many people could get into it. It wasn't like where you own a royalty or you own a field and you can extract some good profits out of it. We thought we wouldn't make a lot of money on wind. But then what we found was our expertise in stakeholder relations and being able to convince people to put something in their backyard with sour gas extended over to wind. And in fact, we have this huge competitive advantage, and there are huge barriers to entry in the wind industry because a lot of people think they're doing God's work with wind industry, which it's great work, but they don't go to the same level of sort of detail and rigor, getting the buy-in of the community and sort of working with the grassroots and stuff. So just an interesting kind of aside. The last policy I'm going to talk about hits on the Marine Stewardship Council. Some of you, I imagine most of you, are probably familiar with that. It's a certification system set up, and it's modeled similar to the forest sort of FSC, Forest Standards Certification, where forestry companies get certified to manage their land in a sustainable way, and then they can get the FSC stamp on their products. So the MSC is the same idea except for seafood. So you're managing the seafood and the catches in a sustainable way, in ways that don't deplete the population or help to rebuild it where the case is that it's already been depleted. So the proposal is to put a tax on all non-MSC certified fisheries in the world, and you can enforce that through similar levels like the U.S. is doing in market protections. It would be a bit of a mess for the WTO, but it could be navigated by some creative lawyers. And then take that money and use it to put into marine conservation reserves. And those are proven to help to replenish fish stocks, and you can do that. The only problem is getting the money to be able to put that aside and then being able to enforce and police it. And so that would be a really interesting idea, something that, an idea that we could come up with in Eastern Canada where these things have some more sort of presence and meaning. I guess when we sort of moving to the end, I kind of have about 8 areas where I think Nova Scotia has tremendous opportunities to really seize the moment and become the leader in not just Canada, but North America and the world. I think with the deep Panuke, we'll see what happens with that, but there could be opportunities there for carbon capture and storage, things like what was based in Norway where they went with state oil, and they've done a tremendous amount of carbon capture and storage. And there's a lot of technologies that can be developed, and then that can be exported, that expertise can be exported as well. Carbon capture and storage at the coal-fired generator facilities, and I know there's studies going on right now to sort of suss out what the geology is and how well that will work. But those 2 areas, and then cogeneration as well, with the thermal plants, obviously you have huge opportunities for cogen. Cogen's already happening here, but there's opportunities to ramp it up. And those things are really labor-intensive, create a lot of jobs. So I think those areas, a lot of potential. Tidal, I guess we don't have to say too much about that, I'm just looking out the window. Really interesting energy. John F. Kennedy spoke about it, not Junior, when he was president, and it's being something that could rival nuclear in terms of the amount of energy security it could provide to the world. Wind jobs, for every $1 million invested in the wind industry, you get about 11 direct jobs. So it's not a bad return on investment. Lots of wind out here, so big opportunity. And not just to do it like Quebec does it, where they get the companies to come in and they don't just import the wind turbine from Denmark or from wherever it's made. They actually go make it, and they get the local communities making it, make that part of the contract. So then you have a local industry developed around it of medium to highly skilled professionals that are making it. I have this other idea. There's Clearwater, with a big company here. They're on one of their members is on the board of the Marine Stewardship Council, the advisory board. But I think it would be neat to see Clearwater and Sobeys work together, because all the supermarkets, we just did a grocery survey of all the big grocery stores in Canada, and one of the huge gaps we found, there's a lot of interesting things going on, recycling bags and more local produce, but there was almost nothing going on with labeling of fish, whether it was Marine Stewardship Council certified or not. And so that could be a really interesting opportunity for a lot of reasons here, given the history and then the industrial dots that line up in a row. On finance, as I sort of mentioned before, finance is a crucial barrier to upfront capital costs, crucial barrier to implementing probably half of the solutions that would green our economy and make us more competitive. So coming up with interesting public-private partnerships and financing vehicles that can provide low-interest loans to businesses and to people who want to make investments in the efficiency of their homes or their factories, and eliminating that barrier of access to capital. The green grid, huge opportunities here with the green grid. You look at the concentration of people. And then mobility. I mean, this is a port. There's all sorts of things coming in here. There's great language skills. There's the deep water that doesn't freeze. I mean, we don't need to go into all the details that make this a great hub. But one of the things that's lacking is infrastructure for trains. And when you look at it, we made huge investments. This country was built on the back of the railroad, and we really haven't invested that much in the railroad in the last 30 or 40 years. And you look at the freight industry, we subsidize them every day. They don't have to pay the full cost of the roads, but yet the train companies, they have to pay the cost of the tracks. So figuring out a way to levy some money off of that industry and then put it into the train industry. And it's a pan-Canadian effort, and it's a North American effort too, but it's something that obviously could be led by people who have a direct interest in being a transport hub. So I think that's a huge opportunity. So in terms of the two goals, I just sort of challenges. I always, when I make my greenhouse gas footprint come traveling around, I always like to put down a few challenges, just trying to offset it. I do my own bit or whatever, but I can rollerblade all I want. I won't take care of that plane that I took out here. So the two challenges that I would just like to put out there, one is I think the Sustainable Prosperity Act and the way that it's been embedded in economic development, as opposed to just in a Ministry of Environment or in sort of a communications bureau, how that you can sort of tell it might not be as serious. How it's been embedded and with all the deputy ministers meeting, that's really leading edge, something that's I'm not familiar with it's occurring anywhere in the world. So I think there's a huge opportunity there. But I think that if the focus was framed on something that could be a real vote winner in terms of green jobs, saying we're going to use the Sustainable Prosperity Act with the goal, and everybody in government's going to know this, so when it comes on their desk, they know to move it quickly. Our goal is to create 50,000 green-collar jobs in Nova Scotia in the next 5 years. So those green jobs are coming from wind, from tidal, from biomass, from green grids, from efficiency upgrades, and we're going to do that right here, 50,000 jobs. And I think the other thing that could be a big opportunity is looking at revenue neutral, not where you're taking money out of the taxpayer's pocket, because that can be dangerous, revenue neutral types of tax shifts, where you're putting tax on things like toxics, or you're putting it on carbon, and trying to figure out to keep that money as well designed and separated from general revenues as possible, and going back to the purpose that you want to accomplish as possible, but getting the prices right, making Nova Scotia the place where the economy works in harmony with the ecology, and the prices here tell the ecological truth, and then the economic truth becomes sweeter and sweeter. So those are sort of my two sort of challenges for you guys in Nova Scotia. And I guess I'll just finish with one of my favorite quotes from the Dalai Lama, which is, sometimes challenges will seem pretty big, but anybody that ever doubts that small things don't make a difference has never been in bed with a mosquito. So, yeah. If anybody has any questions.
I have a question. I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget. I'm originally from Alberta too, Toby, and one of the things, the Sierra Club just did a comprehensive report on the current status of the oil sands, and coming from, that's my home province, I keep reading about it, and I'm anguished about it, quite honestly. In Alberta right now, billions are rushing into the province that could be, they could be funneling so much of that to becoming a clean tech economy. Two-part question. How much are they diversifying now toward that end? And if not, how much do you think the traditional oil business model will hold them and the rest of us back?
Well, right now what happens is, and this is one of the reasons that nuclear can be problematic, is if you have one industry that's sucking up a huge amount of capital, it takes it away. There's only so much capital that exists in the economy. It takes it away from other productive uses. So you have a large part of Ontario's manufacturing sector now focusing on providing and servicing the oil sands rather than creating the green jobs and the green economy of the future. So there's a problem not just for Alberta, but for the country as a whole. And the country benefits as a whole as well on the monetary level from those jobs and that come out of Alberta. But I think what's going on with Alberta right now is Alberta, I mean, we're both from Alberta, so we can empathize with what's going on, but it's a bit of a cowboy culture still, where, the frontiermanship, you came out there and you had this vast open lands, and you didn't really have to worry about limits. But the thing that I think is going to make Albertans realize that there are limits, and then it'll cascade around the economy, isn't going to be carbon, because carbon is kind of a thing that takes a long time, and you don't necessarily feel it. If you're not in Fort McMurray, you don't even smell it that much. But it's water. And Alberta is on the verge, especially in the south, of having a water crisis. And according to the Ministry of Environment, they're on the verge of having a water crisis in the Fort McMurray as well. They've over-allocated water by some measurements by a ratio of 3 to 1, 3 times more allocations than the existing free flow of water that exists there. So those things, Scotiabank, Scotia Capital has done some really interesting reports on how big of a risk water is. JP Morgan has done some too, but Scotia Capital did it specifically for the oil sands. And what's really interesting is you see these guys like Preston Manning, Preston Manning, and Mr. My Canada doesn't necessarily include Quebec and slash the deficit and take out the gay marriage dudes. He now is dedicating the rest of his life to getting the prices right and reflecting the ecological truths. And his thing he's spending the most time on in Alberta right now is on water. And it was kind of funny, we were working with him on a project with a bunch of oil people and farmers and grassroots people and government people doing this. And it was just kind of funny to see him. And he's really got his heart in it. And part of it is he's had some time to reflect. He has grandkids. And he recognizes that this is the challenge. It's not necessarily railing against Quebec. And so you have those things going on in Alberta. And the current government being so ignorant in many ways of what's going on. I mean, they didn't even know. Mark Nielsku, who's one of the top persons in the world to calculate genuine progress indicators, who's done some work with the GPI out here and then in the U.S. and also all around the country. When he was working for the Deputy Minister of Finance in Alberta, he found out they didn't even know that they're going to run out of natural gas. They weren't even keeping a natural gas capital account for how much was being drawn down. And so there's this real mentality of just like throw things to the wind and just kind of make it happen. And when you look at countries like Norway, the royalty rates are so low in Alberta. You look at how much the Alberta Heritage Fund has in relation to Alaska or Norway, and it's a drop in the bucket. And so I think what's going to happen is there's a real upsurgence happening. There's a meeting about 2 months ago, or just before the election, about a month ago, and this riding didn't go to a Conservative, in a bastion of one of the previous bastion of one of the Conservatives in Alberta. And I wouldn't call them Conservatives because Conservatives are supposed to preserve things. And then they're there, and he said he was getting all these complaints from a room of 400 farmers in a hall, and he said, well, maybe we need a change in government. And you saw 400 people just get up and all aroused and saying, yeah, damn. And so when that kind of thing happens in Alberta, there's this undercurrent happening in Alberta right now in the rural parts that is becoming pretty powerful, where farmers are starting to feel like they're not seeing the benefits of what's going on, they're seeing the cost. And I think that kind of thing is going to open the door. Alberta, as Preston Manning says, Alberta is not afraid of a new political party. So I wouldn't take what's happening in Alberta as a given. And as an investor, I would be very cautious about investing in companies that weren't including that into their calculations going down the road in terms of a price on water and a price on carbon, because I think it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And if it doesn't happen at the will of Albertans, it'll happen at the will of Uncle Sam. So it's something that will happen, but there'll be a pretty jarring hit. The $100 billion is projected to go into the oil sands. I think we'll probably turn it in the next 4 or 5 years. We'll probably be more like $20 or $30 billion. But it's our province, and the oil sands are going to happen on some level, but I don't think they're going to happen anywhere near the scale that some of the people that are more fans of the status quo think.
Toby, that was just an excellent, inspiring talk, and we are trying to be leaders here in Nova Scotia, and I applaud the government with its sustainable prosperity initiatives. That's really great. So at the provincial level, we're really doing some great stuff. I'm very concerned that the federal government is not showing leadership on climate change and really helping position Canadian industry to be competitive, and to, because we're facing a low carbon future. And so I'm really interested in your remarks about the federal government's role here, or currently lack of role. And then the other thing that I wanted to say is I wanted to applaud the work that you're doing with Corporate Knights. I'm a subscriber, and I think it's an excellent publication. I think everybody should subscribe to it because this is where we learn about, innovative things happening and these important and inspiring stories, because the media is not reporting on this adequately, and we're not, like I said, getting, educated, by our federal government on all of this stuff. So I'm glad that Corporate Knights is doing the work that it's doing, and so I hope it gets into the hands of the people here in this room and in the Atlantic Canada region. The other thing that I wanted to mention is we've got the Canadian Business Ethics Research Network. Louise Hannafin is the coordinator, so if you're interested in a network of academics, business and government people trying to move forward business ethics and sustainability work in Atlantic Canada, please see Louise, and please subscribe to Corporate Knights. And what do you have to say about the federal government?
That free subscription is worth every penny. So I think the federal... I was sort of hanging out with John Baird, watching him kind of closely at the Bali climate change negotiations in Indonesia. And I did notice that for one of the crucial periods of negotiations, he was, while the other people in their suits negotiating, he sort of snuck out to one of the parties, and then I saw him by the pool with a martini. So no one got a picture of him, but it was a bit of a news story. I think that the government is doing a pretty good job, except for the fact that if the government was in charge of a pension fund or in charge of a corporation, and the citizens were shareholders, I think the government would probably be facing a severe class action lawsuit for dereliction of fiduciary duty. Regardless of what they think about the environment or how close it is to their hearts, or if they're newly converted or not converted, there are some interesting arguments being made about how you need to have China on board, or else it doesn't matter. But those arguments don't necessarily come from the spirit of actually trying to make something happen. It sounds more like the spirit of obstructionism. But what's going to happen is our economy is going to be hit extremely hard, like the softwood lumber hit us, but instead of a stick on our arm, it'll be a 2x4 in the head, or oil barrel rolling over us. And we're going to have to pay that money to them hand over fist, and we won't have an option because our infrastructure is all tied to it, and they'll be able to put it on, and it'll just be a huge suck on our economy. Over 30 years or 20 years, we may be able to diversify and export to China and places like that and have less risk. But in the immediate medium term, they've got us over a barrel, to pardon the pun. And because we haven't seen this on the horizon, I mean, you had our ambassador in the front page of the Financial Times and Globe and Mail about a month ago going all over about this, about how we're going to be facing import tariffs on our carbon-intensive products going to the U.S. You have the Pentagon saying this too, when they're not going to purchase things that don't come from a jurisdiction with a similar price on carbon. And so it's a pretty big deal. And they'll have their energy security, and they'll have their billions. And we're going to be losing because of that, and we'll have to play catch up. So our government is not being responsible in terms of a shareholder of our economy, because we're going to see a huge hit happen in the next couple of years because we've been twiddling our thumbs and diddling around. So in that respect, I guess I would kind of agree with you on the federal government in terms of what they've done. But sometimes the best way to get someone to move is a kick.
Mine's a simple question. I'm just wondering, I'm often looking for opportunities to invest in green companies,
Yep.
And when I talk to brokers and portfolio managers, they say, well, oil sands and agriculture and pesticides, and I'm like, I don't want to invest in that. And so can you say something about how to get those investment opportunities more in front of the market, the
Sure.
common market?
So it's kind of neat. I was looking at this. We've been doing these investment surveys, responsible investment surveys, for about 6 years. And you look at the outlook funds and the Meritas funds, and you look at their holdings, and they hold Suncor, Disney, and the same sort of companies you kind of want. And there really is about 99% overlap. The only difference with a lot of these funds is that they try to engage the companies and get them to do incremental change in the boardroom, and to at least do a carbon accounting or water accounting, so they have that information. Or just like the Toxic Reduction Act in Massachusetts, where they got the polluters to do the accounting so they could see how much it would cost to reduce. So that's the kind of incremental change that happens. But what you're talking about is you want to invest in real companies that are really part of the solution in a core way. So unless maybe if you're a millionaire, it's easy. You can just go the venture capital route And a lot of those companies in the venture capital space, 10% of all the companies getting funded in the venture capital space are those types of companies right today, right now. And that's grown tremendously, over tenfold in the last 4 years. So that's neat. But if you want to do publicly traded companies, the TSX is in the process of launching a clean tech index, and they have some 80-odd companies that are already classified as clean tech companies. Most of those companies are not necessarily the safest companies to invest in. Some of them are a little risky, they're a little newer. We launched something earlier this year called the Clean Tech 10, which were the top 10 publicly traded companies on the TSX. And then there's also the next 10, which are the sort of top 10 privately held companies that have the best prospect of breaking into the economy with the good technology that makes a difference. So I'd say you still, on your hand, can count probably about 10 at the most that are on the TSX that you could directly invest in. But there is one fund, or maybe there's two funds that I would sort of recommend. There's Criterion has two funds, a water fund and a clean energy fund, and they're pure plays on companies that are mostly or entirely dedicated to providing water and energy solutions. So those are just typical mutual funds that anybody can buy. And then Enhance, and I guess I have to give the cautionary, please read the investment prospectus. But in Enhance also, I find they have an interesting approach where they really look for solution providers, large global companies, companies like Vestas Wind Systems. But these kind of companies are even turning up into Templeton Growth Fund, one of the largest growth funds, mutual funds in Canada. Their largest holding is Vestas Wind. So it's not necessarily just in the sort of the ethical funds where it exists. So I hope that's a little bit helpful. I mean, there's microfinance vehicles that exist through credit unions too, and community bonds and things of that nature. But if you want to invest in those like solution provider environment companies, I would check the Clean Tech 10, Enhance, and Criterion.
Thanks.
Toby, I was surprised that you spoke so glowingly about China. You sounded like the Minister of Foreign Trade. But I think, what makes you think that China is just going to jump on the environmental bandwagon? I mean, what can we do as a nation and as individuals to encourage somebody like China to become more environmental?
Well, China's interesting. There's sort of like two forces in China. There are long-term forces and sort of central planning forces, the State Environment Committee, that understand that right now 10% of their economy is being lost, their GDP is just being decimated by the smog that their carbon-intensive, including development path, is creating. They also realize that they're on a path to run out of water in the next 10, 15 years. And we did a back page thing on it last issue. The number one issue that there are public protests in China, sometimes as many as 50,000 people, are for environmentally related disasters or pollutions or river effluents and things going on of that nature. So the people who run China understand that it's in their interest to figure out some sort of harmony with ecology. But the problem is it's such a juggernaut going so quickly that there's all these forces that are decentralized now that are just trying to make a buck, and they get rewarded if they make a buck, the local administrators and facilitators. So I've had some discussions with some interesting people that are at fairly high level in China, in Indonesia. We were throwing this idea by them. And they actually are open to the idea of having a carbon tax placed in China where they get to keep the money in China for a couple of reasons. And I was surprised at first that they were even open to the idea, but the reasons were, one, the government's looking for another source of revenue. Governments always love revenue, but there's reasons where they're hitting a bit of a wall. China has really interesting tax schemes. They get 80% of all the money that they do from income and corporate income tax through a speculation tax on the securities traded in the Chinese stock market. So they have something like, I think it's a 0.3% tax on every transaction on their stock market, and then that generates equivalent amount of money minus 20% to all the income and corporate taxes. So they have some interesting tax vehicles already going on. They have some experience with that. And so they see the prospect, if they do at large point sources in a manageable way, sort of the top 400 choke points of where carbon collects in the Chinese economy, if it's part of a global system and the rest of the world is doing it, they do it, they can collect the money. And then the other upside that they see is that what they said sort of in private was, we are afraid that you are going to screw us. We hear what the U.S. is talking about. We hear all the protectionist forces, the labor community, the environmental community, the special interest corporate community. It's a pretty weird alliance that we think to have some pretty horrific consequences on our access to some crucial markets. And this won't just stop in the U.S. Germans are talking about it. The French are talking about it. And when one country does it, it opens the doors for a lot of other countries. So they don't want to see, they depend on global trade more than any other country probably in the world. And they don't want to see trade anarchy ensue. And part of the way to not seeing trade anarchy ensue is getting a harmonized market for carbon, one price globally set. They also see that they have a little bit of bargaining room because they didn't create the mess to begin with, like we did here in the developing world. 70% of the mess up there came from the Western world developing, not from China. They're a relative newcomer to this. So they see that they can play on that from the justice side and also from the guilt side to probably get some pretty serious cash over 3 or 4 or 5 years from adaptation funds and a bit of a levy taken off of our carbon market and applied to their country and other developing countries. So they see the carrot, they're scared of the big booming stick of trade anarchy, and then they also like the idea of more revenue. And from a long-term perspective, the Chinese economy, the way it's developing right now, the number one reason China will fall off the tracks won't be because of Tibet or the Dalai Lama. It'll be because of an environmental revolution, people uprising because they have no clean air to breathe. I was just there for 3 days in December, going to see a solar factory that was powered by coal. And they had the lights on instead of the solar lights. I was a little bit concerned. And they, I couldn't see. I was in the train going all around and stuff, and it was like a thick haze hanging over the entire country. And so that's not something that's sustainable. So I think China wants to do the right thing, but they're like us. We're going to need a bit of a kick in the butt from the developed world, but with the carrots dangling as well.
That was really great.